Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Teacher's Point of View. We've got a superstar from season one back on, Elroy Cahill, everyone, who's basically the head teacher of Kingsley Academy in Hounslow, West London. Elroy, welcome back on. And obviously, I kind of gave you a bit of a brief, but this conversation in season two has evolved to like where education is and kind of what needs to happen to, and what are the right changes that need to be implemented to make sure we progress in education and we don't just stay where we've been for the last 50, 60 years, you know? I mean, like, kind of where do you see it, where education is, and do you currently see it, do you see it being fit for purpose?
I think there's always room for improvement with everything. I think one of the most unpopular education ministers, well, until the current one perhaps, was Michael Gove, and I think he got an awful lot of flack for changes that he brought about. So, you know, certainly exams were too easy when he came into power, and I do think that he made some necessary changes in making the qualifications more robust, making them actually have more currency. I think how we went about it perhaps needed significant work. You know, the idea of bringing people with you, perhaps that page was missing in his manual. But I think lots of the changes that were made at that time, I think, were the right changes. Like, I remember in schools that I had worked in, people doing a BTEC in a week, which is ridiculous. So I completely think that those decisions were the right decisions. But is it currently fit for purpose? Well, I suppose the short answer is no, in the sense that there is still way too much disparity between the haves and the have-nots. Like, if you're from an upper class kind of, or, you know, upper middle class family, you still have way more opportunity and way more advantage than if you don't come from a family like that. And I think, like, I always look at the experience, you know, my experience in the educational system in Ireland maybe wasn't brilliant, but I look at the equity and kind of fairness in the Irish system, where private schools by and large don't exist. Like, there's maybe 3 or 4, but they don't really exist. And everyone goes to the kind of the local comprehensive school. And actually, it seems a fairer method. And I think what is also, certainly it seems fair in Ireland, is, you know, university is free for everyone. So it doesn't matter if you're from a low income family or not. You don't have to pay fees. And there's like a grant that you can get if you're from a very low income family to pay for your accommodation. And I think that it's definitely fair. Like, I know that there's people who went to school with me who absolutely, if you pay for university like you do in the UK system, they would not have gone to university at all. So when I compare the British system to that, and I'm not saying the Irish system is perfect, it's not, but it certainly seems fairer and more fit for purpose in Ireland than here in many regards, from a kind of a social mobility perspective. Do I think that education system is fit for purpose with regards to accountability, with regards to kind of the measures that are in place, etc.? It's a difficult one. Like, if you look back at kind of education in the 1990s, and everyone kind of harks back to the ILIA days, you know, the golden days of the Inner London Local Authority, standards were dreadful and children didn't get particularly good grades in the majority of schools. So actually that wasn't fit for purpose either. I do think we've gone the other way. You know, we're famously obsessed with accountability. We're famously obsessed with data. We're famously obsessed with league tables. I think maybe we have lost some of the true purpose behind education. And, you know, it would be good to try and have a balance of the two. But how you achieve that, I think, is the nirvana. And I don't think anyone at the moment has the answer for how we get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made some really good points, right? But I mean, you're absolutely right. I feel like it's gone to the other way, though. The high stakes accountability. I mean, in my opinion, like, looking from an outsider, all I see is schools competing with each other and actually hindering the evolution of education and the way that we can kind of blossom together. I mean, multi-academy trusts, they do that well because you've got like practitioners that you can bounce off from different schools in different settings, right? But unfortunately, those schools that are maybe failing or not doing so well, that aren't part of academy trusts, like multi-academy trusts, they kind of left to get on with it. And if you've got league tables that, and Ofsted, that are labeling you as require improvement or special measures, or you're at the bottom of the league table, I mean, how are you ever going to get out of that rut? You know, I mean, we spoke about it last time, but it's almost impossible to attract the right staff, get parents going on the same journey as you, and getting those kids to want to be there, you know. And instead of like schools that are outstanding in the area going to them and helping them and actually sending maybe practitioners their way and helping them develop in certain areas, all that's kind of happening is schools are leaving them to get on with it. I mean, I think that is just ruining education, don't you think?
I think, you know, I've worked in a few schools in my career that have been special measures. And I remember in one of them, when we got put into special measures, I just joined. And two of my friends who don't work in education said, oh, special measures, that's good things. That means you get like special measures, they give you lots of support. And you think, no, you don't get anything extra. So like, I do actually think in like, this is my personal view, not necessarily saying it's, you know, the right view, but it's what I think. I think that the inspecting system that Ofsted have, I can see the merit in it. I do think it's right that kind of people come and, you know, look at the standards in a school. Can you fairly assess a school in just 2 days? Probably not, no. But I do see the value in a method of kind of reviewing and critiquing what goes on in a school, because I've worked in a few schools which truly have been dire and actually there's been no accountability. But I do think that if a school needs improvement, actually then there should be some mechanism whereby that support is brokered. It would be great to see like an inspectorate who is able to kind of broker that school improvement and say, well, look, you know, you do require improvement and these are the 5 things you need to work on. And actually, let me signpost you to where that support is. You know, this school down the road, which is great at X, is going to help you with that. You know, this school in East London, which is fantastic at Y, is going to send somebody in to work with your head of department, whatever. Like that would actually be a really positive move for education, in the sense that we would be learning, like, yeah, there would be accountability and there would be kind of feedback and review, and you'd never please anyone, but actually it would genuinely feel that support was there. So a school in special measures would actually get support, which at the moment doesn't really happen, unless, like you said, part of a matter or something.
Yeah, I mean, it sometimes feels like they just go in, judge you, and then they kind of say, this is what you need to improve on, and they kind of just let you get on with it, right? I mean, like there should be some follow-up or some like actual guidance on how you can improve. I think like look, in some respects, I believe that it should only be good and RI. I mean, there shouldn't necessarily be an outstanding or special measures, because every child deserves a good education, right? In the UK, in my opinion. I mean, around the world, but I mean, let's talk about the UK because that's what we're doing. But like there's certain children that go to special measures schools or like require improvement schools because of like where they're born, like location, right? I mean, you've got parents that are sending their children 15 miles down, like away from their house, because they want to send them to a better school than their local school. I mean, how is it that we still got schools that are failing in the system that we've got, you know? And I think that's down to some respects, the high accountability. I mean, it should be good or like satisfactory and failing or like just requires improvement. And then there should be a support plan to get these schools up to the standard that we need to. I mean, that's the only way that we're really going to get like good quality education to every child, right?
Well, it would be really positive if it was, you know, meets the standard or doesn't meet the standard, wouldn't it? And if you meet the standards, then, you know, you're, in today's language, a good or an outstanding school. And if you don't meet the standards, then you're kind of below that and you get the support. Like there's parts, like you've briefly mentioned this, there is parts of England where, you know, in a local town or city, there's no school which is good or outstanding, and actually the road requires improvement or inadequate, and they have been like that, particularly kind of in the north of England, in Northumbria, you know, in parts of the country like kind of near Carlisle, etc. There's seas of schools which are requires improvement and inadequate, and there might be maybe one outstanding school, but the majority are not successful. And actually, you know, why is that? Is that because there is a challenge around funding? Is that because there's a challenge around the pipeline of teachers and the pipeline of leaders? Yeah, I think maybe there needs to be a greater think piece around how are we tapping in to what's going well in education in some parts of the country, and then kind of supporting other schools in parts of the country to replicate that or to bring it in their own way, like adapt it for their setting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the thing is, and again, like it kind of like go back to Ofsted. I mean, sometimes I feel like there's a disparity because sometimes, like for example, if an Ofsted inspector goes to schools in Ealing and then kind of Hounslow is the neighbouring borough, I mean, you've got complete different demographics in the neighbouring boroughs. So I mean, like sometimes they might have this perception of what a good school is in Ealing, and then try to take that perception into a school in Hounslow, which might need to be assessed in completely different ways. I mean, like it should maybe head teachers not hold each other accountable in some respects in the local area and work together and collaborate and actually, I mean, you still got the accountability, but actually what you've got then is a supportive mechanism. Is that something that maybe could work?
Yeah, I think there's definitely scope for there to be like a peer review process. There is organisations like that, like Challenge Partners. There's a few other organisations that do that peer-to-peer support. I guess the challenge that you'd have potentially would be there is kind of this innate competition anyway within some kind of local areas that would need to be factored in, you know, to make sure it's kind of not biased. But I think there's definitely value in a peer-led feedback system or inspectorate or something like that. Like if you had a mechanism whereby you had a panel of like maybe, I don't know, 5 head teachers from other parts of the city who then came to inspect your school, I think you'd find it pretty hard pressed to find a head that actually would find that to be an unfair model, in the sense that they're people who are doing your job, giving you feedback, who understand the pressures, who understand the challenges. And, you know, maybe that would be a fairer mechanism. I think what is positive is that in the current inspection kind of process with Ofsted, they do have some additional inspectors who are people who are serving heads. I think they always tend to have that balance and that kind of sense of perspective. So when you kind of see an inspection team coming in and you research them, you see that, you know, 3 of them are currently heads, you know, part of you thinks, good, okay, because you know that you're going to get a fair crack of the whip.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but the thing is, there's still so many schools that kind of aren't being supported to get out of like the RIs or the special measures, right? I mean, they're just kind of left to it. And then it gets to the point where they failed so much that they have to be taken over by a multi-academy trust. You know what I mean? I mean, like, it shouldn't get to that stage, right? I mean, it does. Look, ultimately, there's always going to be a need for variety. I think there's always going to be a need for traditionalist schools. There's going to be there's going to be a need for multi-academy trust and state schools, right? I mean, but it's about kind of making sure that each of them work, and we can try to kind of give like each school a fair crack at trying to give these children a better education. You know, I mean, do you think it's because of the lack of funding that kind of lets these schools down, or do you think it's something else?
Funding is definitely a challenge, and I think, you know, despite what is communicated around funding levels are at an all-time high for the last, I don't know, 5 years or whatever it might be, like funding in real terms, if you take inflation into account, has gone down year upon year upon year. And actually there are a few kind of popular moves perhaps where, you know, teachers' pay is going to be increased in line with inflation, which, to be fair, I think nearly every head would support. But actually, when that comes out of your already pretty tight funding, so that difference is not kind of paid for by central government, it does mean that actually funding in schools has gone down. So although teachers, rightly, in my view, got a pay cut in line with inflation, it did mean more money being stripped from school budgets. And that is challenging, because actually we're learning to do more with little, or less, should I say. And like, schools are remarkably, I don't know, remarkably inventive. Like, we'll always find a way to make something work. And I think that's been seen by how schools at the 11th hour were able to kind of put together plans for mass testing when, you know, a $1 billion track and trace contract perhaps didn't do a necessarily marvelous job at doing so. But schools will always find ways to make things work. But the question I think perhaps should be, should schools have to be really inventive and really try and make and do and find ways forward with even less and less funds? Because if we're saying that we're not going to invest in schools, we're not going to invest in young people, then what's that going to lead to down the line? And ultimately, particularly with all of this lockdown and, lost learning and kind of increase in domestic violence and increase in mental health and all of those things, schools are going to need more resource than ever. I don't necessarily foresee there being an increase in funding to support us with doing that. I think there will be an expectation that we'll find solutions to it, but I don't necessarily see that funding being forthcoming. And I would desperately love to be proven wrong, but I don't anticipate that is in the pipeline.
I mean, I think the big problem with funding, though, is that because look, I mean, I was speaking to one of my friends who used to work for the Treasury, and each sector, obviously, you've got their secretary of each sector that, depending on their charisma, they go in and win a pot of the money, right? And we've got Gavin Williamson winning money for education, which leaves us a little bit vulnerable, doesn't it? I mean, but even then, he's pulling out a number out of thin air, right? I mean, he's not been in the classroom, he's not been in a school, he's not ever led a school to success, right? So this number that comes out of thin air that he's managed to win, I mean, he doesn't even know necessarily where that money should go, and it's not even near enough of what needs to be put into the education system. So, I mean, it doesn't look like the funding is going to increase. So, I mean, ultimately, I think, look, and it shouldn't be the teacher's responsibility to be inventive, but in some respects, we've got to be, right? And we've got to find ways that we're still going to give every child an opportunity to succeed, because ultimately, that's what I want, and that's what educators get into education want, right? Well, hopefully, anyway. But ultimately, how can we make sure that we are still going to give these children an opportunity, even if there is a lack of funding? I mean, this is again why I think schools need to come together. I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think the key thing that's going to be integral to changing children's lives is great teachers. And I think once there is continued investment in teacher training, once there is continued investment in trying to develop great teaching across the piece, across the sector, then ultimately we will see, children, particularly this kind of era of children who've kind of gone through lockdown, being supported. But ultimately, funding is always going to come back up to the fore, because if you have teachers who are stretched, who are teaching more and more periods, more and more lessons, because there's not enough funding for more teachers, then something will have to give. So I think it's really challenging, and it's quite a complex one. If there can be such a thing as a positive from the COVID and the downturn of the economy, would be that I think more people will consider teaching as a career, because it is a stable job. You're unlikely to be furloughed. Well, you won't be furloughed as a teacher, etc. And they're maybe not the right reasons to go into teaching, but ultimately, let's be realistic. Some people will consider it as a career route, particularly graduates. Because of that stability. And even if we keep some of those great teachers in the system who perhaps wouldn't have considered it otherwise, that to me is a positive. But we do definitely need more investment in mental health provision, in social care, in community projects, etc., because we can't underestimate how badly communities will be ravaged by COVID. And that is, I don't think teachers are going to be felt really until months after the pandemic. I'm talking 8 to 12 months later, when actually the reality of unemployment and bereavement and all of those things really kicks in.
Absolutely. I mean, I was speaking to one of my friends who's a property investor and he's a developer, and he's basically explained the market to me in housing. And what he's explained there is that there's so many people on mortgage holidays at the moment. There's a lot of people on furloughs. So we still haven't seen the effects of what that's going to happen, what's going to happen once we come out of the furlough and the mortgage holidays. We'll see loads of repossessions. And actually what's going to happen is that the property market is going to be flooded with lots of properties that investors just can't flip. And it's going to cause a lot of repossessions. Right. And we still, you're right. I think we still got the worst to come. And it's about how do we kind of get these children ready for the change? Because I think emotional intelligence is so important in terms of develop. We've got a lot of mental health. We spend billions on it every single year. So why are we not instead of being reactive, why aren't we being a bit more proactive and investing in more money in that aspect of education, and those emotional intelligence coaches to come in and support these kids? I mean, I was speaking to, I won't mention her name, but I was speaking to a head teacher based in London too, and she's a very traditional head teacher, and her view is schools are doing a lot in terms of pastoral and working with families. I completely understand. I'm not taking anything away from teachers in doing that, but these people get trained to be emotional intelligence coaches and have action plans on how to work with children. And they're specialists at what they do, and teachers, unfortunately, I mean, you train to become a teacher, you don't train to become a counsellor, right? And it's two very different things. I mean, like, do you think that would make the world of difference, being able to invest money in things like that?
Yeah, definitely. We had, so when I was a deputy head of Mitcham, I forget the name of the organisation, but it was basically they provided kind of therapeutic counsellors and, emotional well-being people to work with students who'd undergone trauma. We had a number of students at the time who had, pretty complex home lives, a few who had kind of fled war overseas. And I think that the investment that we had at the time was really worthwhile because the impact was tangible. Like, I'm not going to say every student who had access to those services absolutely kind of thrived, but certainly a larger proportion of them thrived than would had if that resource was not there. But I think sadly the funding, again, it comes down to funding. If the funding is not there, you will cut things that become a luxury. And it's awful to say that, but actually these things do become a luxury because if it's a difference between, appointing a science teacher or appointing, somebody who's able to do therapeutic counselling, well, your heads are going to choose a science teacher, sadly, because they have to deliver their curriculum. So, yeah, I think there is definitely a lot of funding announcements. There has been kind of since lockdown at this catch-up premium and, the 16 to 19 catch-up funding announcements, etc. But I think what perhaps was lost in the detail was the fact that they had cut things like the Year 7 catch-up premium. So actually, schools didn't really, in real terms, come out better from a money perspective. In fact, some schools came out less well off. I would really hope that there is some foresight going into policy making to say, well, actually, how are we going to support schools to help those students who have been bereaved, who do have mental health issues, who have been impacted by lockdown, etc. And I'm hopeful, optimistic, that there would be those conversations going on in the Department for Education, with advisors, etc. But the challenge always is the political element. You're only as good as the person who makes those decisions, and ultimately those decisions will lie with the government, not with advisors.
I mean, I know, unfortunately, look, I completely appreciate you have to be, in some respect, like diplomatic towards the government, but Jesus Christ, they've made a nightmare of this whole situation, haven't they? I mean, like they've been absolutely awful for the last 10 to 12 months. And to be fair to them, I gave them a chance until July. I mean, I was backing them. I was like, they're doing everything they can. I mean, it's a difficult situation to be in, but actually it's been so reactive, the U-turns, the getting suing Greenwich Council for doing right by their schools, and like to getting Ofsted to complain, like getting parents to complain to Ofsted. I mean, like the whole, it's like it's them against you. I mean, there's a real breakdown in communication between politicians and education decision makers, right? I mean, I don't even know if educators are making the decisions because, like, actually, any head teacher that I've spoken to doesn't feel like they're being listened to, and actually question who these people are that the government are saying that they're listening to, because I've not met one yet, by the way, and I've met loads of people in the last 3 months, and I haven't met anybody that actually knows anybody either. So, because ultimately research does show that emotional intelligence, like if a child is happy and they know how to deal with emotions, they're going to get better grades anyway, And so, it's something that we definitely need to incorporate because we know that, like, social media on your phone, it creates, it increases the level of dopamine that is released in your brain. So when you, it's like an addiction, like you want that social approval. If you don't get likes, if you don't get comments on your post, you get anxiety, you get social anxiety. And that's a big problem in mental health. What we need to be thinking about how we're going to actually incorporate certain like coaches that can actually help, or even if you train the teachers to help these kids deal with those emotions, because I think that's the big problem. We're trying to get them to pass an exam in some respects, and we're not actually dealing with like the fact that these children are maybe going through whatever they're going through. We're not helping them deal with that trauma. So they take it on to their afterlife, or after school life, and I mean, it's heartbreaking, really. You go through 18 years of your life not feeling like you're not actually ready for the working world. I mean, what are we doing in those 18 years if we're not preparing children?
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think the challenge is definitely trying to ensure that we stay positive around decisions, but ultimately that we do have some influence in the sector. And I think that, you've briefly mentioned at the beginning of your comment, the idea that, who is giving advice to the decision makers. And, I imagine it may well be an echo chamber of, a very small group of people who are saying what the decision makers want to hear. I would hope that there would be more opportunities for head teachers to influence policy. And if you look at, is it Jacinda Ardern? Is that the New Zealand Prime Minister?
Yeah.
So Jacinda Ardern has, appointed people who lead education, who lead health, who lead, key sectors, who are not necessarily members of our own political party, but actually who have a background in that discipline. So it's almost like a broad consensus or a broad church of kind of cross-party working because of what's going on with COVID. And actually, by and large, it's having some impact. And I think that, we've had, I think, one education secretary who's been a teacher, Estelle Morris, back in the
20 years ago.
In the 80s. Yeah. To be fair, I don't think she necessarily lasted awfully long. But I do think it's important that you have people making decisions. And if that's not a politician, fine. But if that's a policy maker, a senior civil servant or something like that, who has worked in education, who gets education, or at least takes the time to reach out and find out what people in education think, that's integral to the success of any policy. Because otherwise, we're making decisions without really thinking about the repercussions on the ground. Which would be the same as, if I didn't teach and I was making decisions around what I expected teachers to do, without actually any sense of what that would look like in real life, I would be detached from reality. And, I don't want to commit to saying that I feel the government is detached from reality, but I do think that perhaps they don't always think through what the impact will be on the sector and how schools will manage decisions that are made at the last minute or U-turns, etc. I am pleased, TJ, but pleased is maybe strong. I am assured that the decision that has been made today by the Prime Minister around schools not starting back till the 8th of March at the earliest is a welcome change to the last minute decision making. He did say at the earliest, which I would hope would lead to kind of dispelling some of those conversations in the media in the last 2 days around schools should open now, schools should open now. I'd love nothing more than my school to be open with everybody in. I don't like an empty school, but actually this is more than, schools need to open now. This is about life or death, actually. And, when we're looking at numbers of the death toll at like 1,400 or 1,600 or whatever, that's a huge number. If we become desensitized to that, then we really are done for as a society.
Yeah.
This is, yes, impacting on everybody. Yes, impacting on mental health. Yes, impacting on children's learning. But all of those things can be recovered. Death can't be recovered from. Do you know what I mean? I think we just need to keep that perspective without sounding harsh. Somebody said to me the other day, well, it was a while ago, a few weeks ago, and they said, oh, you're not worried about, all the children's missed out learning. Of course I am. But actually, I want the children to come back alive to be able to do that. And actually, I want their family members to still be alive. This is not a flash in the pan. It's not the flu. It's something quite serious. I think we just need to try and keep that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just kind of go on something that you kind of mentioned earlier, right? I mean, yeah, with everything that's gone on, in some respects, it's kind of given graduates a push to kind of want to get into teaching, right? But again, the problem lies is that the statistics show that teachers leave within the first 5 years. And it's like almost what we're trying to do is just kind of keep the wheel spinning. Do you know what I mean? And it's actually what we should be doing is thinking about how we're going to reinvent this wheel so it doesn't have to just keep spinning. I mean, like we're trying to do the same thing every year, expecting different results. And it's about time, I think, we like change that, right? I mean, like, let's make it a sustainable and a profession and where people actually love doing what they do. Because I think teachers love doing what they do. It's all about those light bulb moments for a teacher, isn't it? I mean, that's what you strive for. But ultimately, it becomes so much about data and actually ticking boxes and actually like getting exam results. I mean, it's almost like think about what is the purpose of education? Is it just to teach them content so they can pass an exam? Or is it actually about trying to give them the right life skills to go on and have successful lives beyond school? You know, I mean, I'm not saying that every single student needs to know what career they're going to go into, but actually what we should be asking them is what kind of person do you want to become? And actually, when you know what kind of person you want to become, like then you're in a far better situation to decide what kind of career you want to go into. But my big problem is a lot of children leave school feeling lost, like not knowing what kind of person they want to become, you know, and that's where I think in some respect, that's where our system is failing our children, you know. I mean, like, what can we do to make sure that we are retaining teachers that are coming into the profession? Because if we continue with the high stakes accountabilities, nothing's going to change, is it?
I think there needs to be more focus on what I would consider to be toxic leadership. And you know, there is a large number of schools that are toxic schools where actually, you know, people who would otherwise probably stay in the profession leave the profession because they've had a bad experience.
Yeah, true.
And you know, I've spoken elsewhere around the fact that I know that I was part of a toxic system at one point in my career, and I was part of the problem. But I think ultimately what I find slightly alarming, if you will, is that I don't think that there is enough focus on standards from the perspective of head teachers and leaders. Like if you were a doctor and you had a high number of people who died under your care, you know, you'd be held to account by that or for that by, you know, some kind of board of ethics. And that doesn't necessarily happen in education. You know, if you have someone who leads an academy trust, you know, I'm really lucky to work for a great academy trust, but if you work for an academy trust or working for a head and, you know, a large number of people in your organization left the profession for good, there should be some method of being able to ask questions about why that is, because these people oftentimes go unchecked, move into other roles, or eventually they get found out in the school or the trust they're in, they move to another one and they do the same thing there. And actually, I don't think that's helpful. I think the deregulation in many ways of education, and I can see why it's been done to create that kind of concept of competition, has actually also made some problems in the sector, because you do have this issue around toxic schools and people acting in a way that would not be accepted in any other profession, but for some reason is accepted in some sectors of education.
Yeah, I mean, like you talk about these toxic environments, right? And I mean, I think a big part of that sometimes is the level of exclusions that happen. I know you're quite like against exclusions in some respects, aren't you? I mean, like, talk to me about exclusions, because some head teachers still believe that that's the right answer, right? But some of these kids come from broken families, deprived areas, or whatever they're going through in terms of trauma, and then you just then reject them from school without actually trying to give them like the right counselling and the right support to help them overcome that. I mean, like, where do you stand with exclusions?
Well, look, as a student, I was excluded a lot, and you know, permanently excluded. And I do understand why those decisions were made. You know, I'm against a system where actually exclusions come thick and fast for no reason. Like, I exclude students on fixed term exclusions, but I always try and do it as a last resort. I'll always try and find an alternative method without just kind of leaping immediately to a fixed term exclusion. I try and use permanent exclusion as a very last resort. I'll always try and find a managed move or a managed transfer, or like look at something which is an alternative to exclusion. But I think we need to ask ourselves that there are a number of schools that have sky high exclusion levels. You know, when I joined Kingsley, our exclusion levels shot through the roof because actually we were implementing a new behaviour system and raising standards, and that will always happen. But when you see schools which are outstanding sometimes, but have, you know, 5 or 6 permanent exclusions a year, and actually they have, you know, sky high fixed term exclusions all year round, and they don't go down in a year, you do have to ask some long and hard questions around, you know, is this high standards or is this something else? Is this some kind of social cleansing of, you know, students who have SEN need or who have behaviour need, rather than putting in place support and nurturing and development and mentoring for those students to allow them to be successful, because ultimately they can be successful 9 times out of 10 with the right level of support and guidance. And I think that, again, to come back to this concept of funding, and I know it sounds like the only thing I'm talking about, maybe some of that is funding based, because if schools don't have the funds for those interventions and those strategies, is that what is leading to kind of higher exclusion figures? I don't necessarily know the answer to it, but I think what is like unequivocal is that there are certain things that would always lead to an exclusion, like bringing a knife on site, or, bringing drugs on site. Like, I understand why they would be exclusions, but I think if you have children being excluded for more minor transgressions and being permanently excluded for them, then I think, is that really socially inclusive?
Yeah, I understand. I mean, look, even just on the knives and the drugs, though. I mean, like, some children that's what they grow up around. I know, obviously, you got to try to do the best and you got to look after the other children, but if we kind of just send them to an alternative provision, like, and because they've obviously brought a knife in or drugs in, I mean, all we're telling them that is like there's no way out of it. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's almost like, well, you're not good enough to be here. And I know it's such a difficult situation, but I mean, do we need to be doing better for these kids and going through a more thorough process in terms of trying to get them out of that rut before we get to exclusion? I know you kind of said it's last resort, but I mean, I think we've still got labels, I mean, like on certain children that come with certain baggage, right? But unfortunately, it's not their fault that they're born into that baggage, you know?
Yeah, as someone who was born into a family with baggage, I can absolutely get that. I do think there is a need for there to be a wider lens on actually what contributes to some of those social challenges and social problems. I don't think we can lay all of those problems at the doors of schools. And I think that sometimes that's a handy way out for some of the decision makers in society to say, oh, well, the schools should deal with that. Why are the schools letting that happen? And actually, yeah, of course, schools have a part to play, but it is more than that. It is about, what support are families getting, what support are social services putting in place, what support are local authorities putting in place, what are the institutions within society doing to work with students who do come from more complex homes, that do have additional baggage, as we've said. And actually, school is just one of those institutions. It's not the only institution. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind. And again, to come back to the word that I keep talking about, I think that comes down to funding. Well, yeah, it's true. And like ultimately, we're increasing our defense budget, bizarrely, but actually we're not increasing our budgets for education, for social care, for community projects, etc. And if you look at the amount of community projects that have been cut, particularly in some of the more kind of deprived inner city communities, and also the rural, deprived communities, where they really are a lifeline in some of those really isolated rural areas, they've all been cut, or nearly all been cut, and that's because of the significant cutting in the last 12 years of funding for community projects. It is difficult to find a community project in any area that has not been ravaged by cuts to their sector. And they are integral to supporting, at-risk students and students who are vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like it's remarkable, isn't it? Because the population increases and then the budget decreases. And I think that the reason, I think it's quite funny because you talk about education secretary and the average lifespan is 18 to 24 months, isn't it? So if somebody comes in like Gavin Williamson, has a brilliant idea of what he wants to do with education, thinks something needs to be implemented into the curriculum, and then we have a 250-page document like we do, right? And then like somebody else comes in 2 years later, has another idea, makes the curriculum even bigger. Then you need more teachers because you have to try cram in more information, and then they spend money elsewhere what they think is important. And actually, the money that Gavin Williamson spent on, like the things that he spent on, is actually forgotten about. So what a waste of money, Like, I mean, does there need to be a better system where maybe the government say, look, here in education, here's a budget for 10 years. Like, I mean, it might not be that much, but at least what you can do in terms of planning, right? I mean, do you kind of education system, like, would that be better? Like, if they had a 10-year budget and were like kind of asked to make a 10-year plan of how to move education forward, would that create a more sustainable education system?
It's like any institution. Like if I had a school and I had, let's say, a head of maths, and the head of maths only lasted 18 months, and then it kept changing, it kept changing, it kept changing. Well, it wouldn't lead to a particularly high-functioning maths department, no matter how good the maths teachers were. So it's the same concept, really. So there's definitely a need for stability. And actually, it's interesting because I've not really thought about the lifespan of an education secretary before. How long has Gavin Williamson been the education secretary?
I think he came into power November 2019 or October 2019, around that time. So it's been about a year and a bit. So I'm sure his lifespan is about to come to an end.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Hopefully. Fingers crossed.
Okay. So it's interesting because you're correct in the sense that, you know, policy does change a lot. And ultimately, you know, I think the policy is directed by the Prime Minister, isn't it? So if a Prime Minister's tenure is for, you know, however many years, you would hope that the education policy wouldn't change dramatically during that time. But what is interesting is we've had the current government, or certainly an iteration of it, for a very long time, and yet we've seen significant change. So is it even about stability with regards to leadership that kind of makes the sector more stable? Or is it making the sector non-political and removing kind of the political tags to it? Should the Secretary of State for Education be a non-political figure? I don't know, maybe. Should they have to kind of be there for a, you know, 8 or 9 year tenure? Perhaps. Would it lead to better standards? I think I would like to think it would. I think it would definitely lead to a greater sense of completion, because actually at the moment we have lots of things that start and then disappear into the ether, never to be heard of again. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm going to watch with interest to see how things work out in New Zealand, where that's sort of the model that Jacinda Ardern has. And I don't necessarily know anything about Jacinda Ardern politically, other than she seems to be quite stateswoman-like. But the idea of kind of removing the politics, if you will, from these key briefs or these key portfolios, to me sounds common sense. I could be absolutely wrong, but it sounds from a layman's perspective perhaps sensible.
I mean, you only have to look at across the world, right? There's some of the best education systems that are in terms of world rankings. All of them, like, education is a separate entity to politics. I mean, in the Middle East, in Dubai, they've got a Ministry of Education that's just full of ex-educators that they don't go in and label schools or judge them. They go in and ask like where the issues lie, what needs to happen, and they work collaboratively. I mean, it's very similar in Finland. It's very similar in Denmark. It's very similar in like Japan and China. I mean, educators are allowed to just kind of get on with it. You know, I mean, I was speaking to Daniel Reynolds, who's on tonight's episode actually, and he's allowed to use whatever curriculum he feels is best suited for his children, and it kind of gives him the flexibility to like find what's really going to inspire a child or like find their passion. Because some children, they just literally go through school in the UK like expecting like to do okay in GCSEs or A levels and think that's it. Like, I mean, that's what they've got to do to be successful. And actually, they'd go through 18 years of their life never finding anything that they're truly good at. I mean, that is so sad, you know. I mean, like, so to go 18 years of your life never thinking that you're actually brilliant at anything. I mean, like, I was speaking to somebody and they said, a deputy CEO of a trust, and he said, but those kids that are unused, that get to C's, I mean, they've done phenomenally well. Yeah, they've done phenomenally well, but you're still telling them that it doesn't matter how hard they work, they're only ever going to do average. You know, like, I mean, what are you telling a child that they can, like, how are you telling them that they can achieve whatever they want to achieve? Like, we should be inspiring children, right? And right now we're doing more things to kind of tick the box and pass exams. You know, I just think there's just too many systemic failures in some respects. I mean, and this is not down to teachers or schools. It's a systemic problem, I think. I don't know, like, do you agree? I mean, sorry, I kind of go on because I feel so passionately about it. But I mean, like, do you agree? I mean, like, or am I just talking absolute rubbish?
No, I don't think you're talking absolutely rubbish. I think that there's always a challenge because there needs to be a method of assessing how good people are at something, to allow us to then kind of have a functioning workforce. Because actually, if we didn't have qualifications, we didn't have grades, and we didn't have all of these things, ultimately it's a method of screening, isn't it? So it's meant to like screen people who are suitable for roles or for jobs or whatever. So I can see why there's a need for it from a purely kind of workforce labor market perspective. But there is something quite dispiriting about, you know, if a student is working very hard and their English is not at a particular level, and they get grade 2 and they get grade 2 and they get grade 2 in all of their subjects. That's quite dispiriting. Do we need to look at perhaps a more flexible way of allowing kind of people who are newer to the country in particular more time in the education system to get the grades that they are capable of, for example? So, you know, if you arrive in the country with hardly any English at the beginning of year 11, should you be allowed to actually do an extra 2 years of GCSE studies to actually get your language acquisition skills to the right level and then actually to achieve grades that you're actually capable of? Perhaps, but that again would come back to more funding.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. And just we'll finish off on the funding, but I mean, I was looking at some statistics, right? And what I was looking at was the funding that is given to education, like the education profession or the education sector now is matched to what we were receiving in 2010. So actually it went down and now it's kind of got back up to where we were in 2010. But like you said at the beginning of the podcast, inflation has shot up since then. So actually you're still left with less. So yeah, I mean, that's a big problem, isn't it?
Exactly. So although the funding has gone up to 2010 levels, we have to pay the huge inflation costs that have been attached to staff salaries from that. That's not been funded by central government. So in real terms, the funding has not really gone up to 2010 levels. It just means that we need to use that new increase in funding to pay for staff salaries. So it remains broadly the same as it was before. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think it does need a lot of change. I think, you know, the best way to do that is from the system itself. And I think, you know, out of all of this COVID lockdown and lockdown 2 and all of that, what we have seen is that actually some of the best leadership is coming from the sector, and actually it's the sector who's driving improvement rather than the decision makers. And that is, you know, depressing in some ways, but actually also heartening in other ways. It's depressing in the sense that you would hope that actually there would be at least matched levels of leadership from decision makers. But actually, at least we have great leadership within the sector, and they are driving forward some amazing improvements. You know, there's a really good kind of initiative within London called Reconnect London, where, you know, head teachers are in essence trying to replicate London Challenge and, you know, working together to think about, well, actually, how do we remedy some of the challenges that have been thrown up by COVID? How do we reach out to those schools that need additional support? And actually that's, you know, sector led by head teachers who are going out of their way and giving more time to do more work on that. I think it's great, you know, that we have people within the sector who want to do that, who are prepared to go above and beyond. And that, I think, is going to be the driving force in changing education. We'll always have policy. We'll always have politics that will come and go and be to our like or be to our dislike. But actually, it's where we have those people who are just kind of brushing aside the noise and just quietly cracking on and making sure that actually more and more of our schools become strong places where actually children get a great education. That's going to make all the difference, really.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just to kind of sum it up, I mean, like we need less exclusions, we need more funding, we need more funding for emotional intelligence, and coaching for children, and we need more funding for teachers. I mean, ultimately, like there's a pattern there, isn't there? But and you know what? Just on that funding, I mean, just before we finish off, but the saddest part about the lack of funding is, what ends up happening is every year schools will want to invest in like the younger teachers. And what I mean by that is younger in their career. So they're going to cost less, they're more moldable. And what ends up happening is that those ones that are experienced get priced out in some respects because schools have budgets and you're just trying to make the best out of a bad situation, right? I mean, you can't to give a teacher, a UPS free teacher without any responsibility, 48 to 50 grand in inner London. I mean, it puts schools off. Do you know what I mean? And it shouldn't, right? I mean, like experienced teachers bring something to the table. I mean, if we were completely reliant on newly qualified teachers, I mean, we'd have a problem because that expertise to deal with certain situations, we lose that in some respects. So, and that's in some respects, teachers leave the industry because they do get outpriced. I mean, it's so sad, isn't it?
You know what, TJ, though? I would say that like good heads and good leaders will, you know, we'll always have one eye on the budget. Of course we will, but you'll always appoint the right person. You know, if I had, you know, a great NQT and a great experienced teacher, and the great experienced teacher was what my school needed, and actually they were the better candidate, I would always appoint them, even though it might kill me to think, oh, that's another, 12 grand more than I would otherwise be spending. I'll always do the right thing by the kids. And I think that if we lose sight of that and we think about the bottom line only, then that's not achievable, that's not workable. If we were just thinking all the time, well, let's go for the most expensive option all the time, well, that's also not going to work. It is a balancing act, but I think we need to make sure that definitely people who are on UPS 3, etc., are not priced out of education, because actually sometimes they're some of our best staff. One of the best teachers I've ever appointed was 60, and I was told by somebody that I was absolutely mad to appoint a 60-year-old teacher. And you know what? I had 4 amazing years of her working for me, and she had more energy than a 21-year-old and got best results from them. So it's not necessarily around the age and the experience. I think it's about their attitude and what they bring to the table.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll still have a profession that still has those teachers that kind of want to make a difference to kids, and they're not going to be kind of edged out by too much data-driven like kind of curriculums. Do you know what I mean? I just feel like we need to bring the love back into teaching, and I know that people like you are still like in it for the right reasons, but I mean, there's a lot of teachers that do leave the industry every year because they feel like teaching is no longer about teaching. It's far more about the numbers and the data. And actually, it's quite sad when you think about it. Like, each child is looked at as a number and not actually as an individual. And in the 21st century, it's all about identity and being unique. And in some respects, like, kids go into primary school with all these ideas, being innovative, curious to learn. By the time they leave 18, they're like completely the opposite. I mean, just to kind of sum it up, just to finalize, do you feel like the current education system is factorizing children and actually killing creativity and innovation?
I think it's easy to potentially fall into that rut. And that's why it's really important that we actually do keep it about the kids and make them center and foremost of what we do. We know that the thing that's going to influence them the most in having great life chances are great results. And it would be foolish of us to pretend that wasn't important. But it is really important that we don't lose sight of creativity and kind of, innovation, and make sure that actually we're developing not just the child's academic performance, but actually the child as a person. And that's so important, and we can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment we do, but I mean, it seems like it's all about the academics. But look, I mean, we'll leave it there, Elroy. I mean, I really appreciate you coming on, and I mean, sharing your views like you did in season 1. So, I mean, when we get to season 3, I'll have to have you back on and make it a hat trick. But no, it's been a pleasure having you on, and everyone that's watching, thanks for watching.
Lovely, thank you.